Jack Anderson is the Professor and Director of Sports Law Studies at the University of Melbourne, and he joins us on the line all the way from down under this morning. Jack, good morning to you, or good evening to you.
Yeah, good morning to you all.
There's a couple of things I want to talk to you about. Violence in the GAA is the first thing that we kind of dropped you a line about last week when the story was circulating. But I did want to get your thoughts on UFC. I know you've written extensively in the past about the legality of boxing, and there have been calls from some quarters at the weekend to ban UFC. I know you've done a bit of work around MMA in Ireland as well. What's your legal opinion, your consensus view on what the sport, the standing of the sport, where it should be, what we should be doing with it?
Yeah, I suppose the first thing is I'm not a fan of UFC. I don't understand it. I'm more a boxing fan. I'm an out-and-out boxing fan. But I suppose the first thing you have to distinguish between the UFC and MMA. I mean, UFC is, as you have said, a commercial entity, and it's legal to hold such events in some places. In some states in the US, it's illegal in others. And here, even in Australia, some states allow it, some states don't. So I think UFC 221 was in Perth, for example, but it had to operate under a statutory framework. So in some ways, it's almost outside of any regulation. So even so, with the McGregor thing, Nevada State Commission, the State Athletic Commission, can hand down bans, but that's not a ban against the UFC. In fact, when you get the individual UFC fighters, they can just get a flag of convenience and get a license to fight somewhere else. So, I mean, that's out there. One of the things that I found, and I read Joe Brawley's piece, for example, on the UFC, and his calls to ban it. I mean, the thing about that is, the UFC are going to take absolutely no notice of what Joe Brawley says, or indeed what I say. But what I did think was, I did a little bit of work for Sport Ireland on the regulation of MMA here in the Republic. I'm the view it should be regulated. I think you're much better off being transparent about the regulation of it. And I think, though, in an indirect way, what happens in the UFC does have a negative effect. Because there's a lot of people within sports administration, there's a lot of people within combat sports who don't want to regulate MMA. I think that's the best way to deal with it. Our problem in Ireland was, who exactly is the MMA community? So you can regulate a sport like the GAA through its clubs and soccer, but are there clubs in MMA Ireland? Are they just gym memberships, or what exactly are they? So that was the problem we had with it. But I certainly think regulation of MMA is hugely important, because remember, it is the amateur sport, and there's a pathway between the youth and those who want to compete at senior level. You've got to get that right with a combat sport. The UFC itself, that's out there. I mean, the one thing I would say about the UFC is, and it maybe reflects with Joe Brawley's article as well, is you see, those recent fights, you saw a lot of blood and facial cuts, etc. With boxing and the way professional boxing has gone now, it's a lot to do with headshots. The bleeding is inside the brain. I mean, you have to face up to the fact that in both UFC and boxing, direct, intentional, and fictional violence is the name of the game. It's the hurt business, So I think the best thing to do is regulate it, And a lot of people have quoted this John McCain comment, Senator John McCain's comment about human cockfighting.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that was in the context of a debate to whether or not we federally in the US regulate the sport. So, that's where they're going, and I think that's where everyone should go.
Yeah. In terms of how that would impact the sport in Ireland, what type of regulation would you like to see? Would it be around the hosting of events? Would it be around the ability to call yourself a licensed MMA trainer or practitioner, or to, how would the regulations work in practice, do you think?
Yeah, all of the above is the answer. I mean, just because you're a regulated sport doesn't give you a kind of a license to do things, generally, or it doesn't mean that you directly come under the control of, say, Sport Ireland. What it does is it gives you the capacity to build all the key and the boring governance stuff. So safety for boxers or safety for fighters outside the ring in terms of weights and all that, safety within the ring in regards to training of referees and umpires, etc., and thereafter, and care thereafter. But also qualification for who's coaching the people, particularly at kids level. Now, MMA in Ireland, they are doing it. There are entities there that are doing it. And we met with people like John Kavanagh, etc. So they are doing it. But it's to get the critical mass of people people to do it and get the actual policies uniform and on paper. That's the first step. And it's the first step, not because Sport Ireland want it, but just your duty of care towards the participants.
Yeah.
The sport is growing and we have to realise that.
I remember thinking a little bit about this at the time, that actually what the Nevada Athletic State Commission does is act as a sanctioning body for events in whatever the combat sport is. At the moment, like even the Boxing Union of Ireland, and I remember thinking a little bit about this and trying to get to the quasi-legal status that they held. So they can license events, professional boxing in Ireland, but they're not really regulated either. They're kind of it's almost by the fact that they're such an old organisation that there's no real sense of, if they make up rules, no one is there to say, no, sorry, you can't do that. Whereas actually maybe the right thing to do is to have Sport Ireland act as a sanctioning body, or an offshoot of Sport Ireland act as a sanctioning body for combat sports. So there's a basic minimum standard there.
Absolutely, basically, and it's the same with the British Boxing Board of Control. They're self-regulatory bodies, which is an old historical thing. I mean, here in Australia, certain states have specific legislation which regulates combat sports. Every single aspect of it, from the timekeepers to the umpires to the judges to the combat sports inspectors, every single aspect is regulated. And it has to be because of the nature of the sport. That's just a recognition of it. And it goes right down to the medical care that would be provided at ringside. It's not that difficult to do, actually. We have some sports that already operate on a statutory basis, horse racing, greyhound racing. We could easily do that, for combat sports. There would be resistance within, say the Boxing Union of Ireland, that's, and they would say their record is pretty good. That's fine. But the regulation of MMA, and Sweden has a kind of a version of that. That's the one I would look at if we were going to do it in Ireland. And I think we have to take the pragmatic view. I'm not an MMA fan. You can see by the look of me, I don't, participate in it. But I think that's the way we're going to have to go, regulation.
Just if we kind of suspend reality here for a moment, Jack, and we perhaps go into this alternate reality where, say, MMA becomes illegal in this country, or UFC becomes illegal in the United States. Joe Bradley says the term make UFC illegal. I'm not sure that he actually mean MMA, but let's just take that example for a moment. What would the reality be? Is there an appetite from your research for an underground mixed martial arts scene?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the argument, that if you don't regulate it, this sport will go underground. That's always the kind of thing that's made, and it's made with a lot of sports. But that's not an excuse. If something deserves to be criminalised, it deserves to be criminalised, and the police can follow it up. But I think with MMA, you've got to kind of look at it in terms of the regulation rather than the criminalisation. And the interesting thing is, at present, the legal status of MMA is a bit up in the air. We don't necessarily know what exactly the legal status is. Even a sport like boxing, the only reason it's legal is because of an old historical anomaly, so we don't actually know what the status of MMA is. And therefore, if something happens at an MMA event, despite it being licensed, we're not quite sure what the criminal law and civil law aspects of it are. So I would think, for everyone's sake, that we get it regulated.
Do you think that the UFC has in some way hampered the image of mixed martial arts? That, like, we had Chris Fields in studio here with us last week, who does great work out at Straight Blast Gym in Swords, where there's people coming in who actually, like, they use MMA as kind of their mode of fitness and things like that. And I guess the sort of bravado and the ridiculous scenes that we saw in Vegas last week are actually doing a lot more damage to the sport as an organisation, and that the UFC really needs to have a long, hard look at itself rather than the sport itself.
Absolutely. The sport is MMA, and I heard that interview, and there's so much going on, and we have to recognise that, and that's why I think regulation is important. UFC is a commercial entity, particularly, and it was recently bought out there again, and they're commercial operators. They don't care about the regulation or where they'll get licensed, so long as they do get licensed and so long as they make money. So, for example, they were absolutely and lobbied hard to get regulated in New York, because that opens up Madison Square Garden, and that's the way they operate. And they could disappear quite quickly in terms of a commercial organisation, and then the sport of MMA is left. And I think that's what we've got to concentrate on, because you've got the kids coming into the sport, you've got amateurs, and like with all sports, the vast majority of participants are at the bottom pyramid.